3 bison were released onto a Dutch sand dune in the spring of 2007 and told nothing. No supplementary feeding, no managed diet, no safety net. The scientific community watched and predicted with near unanimous confidence that the animals would starve before the first winter was over. They did not starve. What they did instead has spent the last 17 years quietly dismantling 40 years of peer-reviewed consensus about one of the most studied large mammals in European conservation history. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how 3 animals altered the physical geology of a coastline that decades of professional management had failed to touch. And it will permanently change how you read any report that tells you a species belongs in one kind of landscape and nowhere else. Here is the detail that does not fit the official story. The institution that funded, designed, and executed this experiment was not a wildlife charity. It was not a university ecology department. It was a water utility company. Hoon, the agency responsible for managing drinking water infrastructure for the province of North Holland, released 3 European bison onto a protected coastal reserve between Haarlem and the North Sea, imposed a strict prohibition on any human feeding intervention, and then waited. A water company, managing bison, on sand dunes, with no food backup. That is where this story begins. To understand what Hoon was attempting, and why the broader scientific community greeted it with open skepticism, you need to understand what was actually happening to the Dutch coastline in the years before 2007. The coastal dune systems of the Netherlands are not incidental habitat. They are among the most ecologically specific landscapes in Western Europe. 70% of the entire Dutch flora is found in dune systems. 15% of the plant species recorded in Dutch coastal dunes exist nowhere else in the country. The system depends on a precise physical condition: open sand, not grass-covered sand, not shrub-covered sand, bare, dynamic, wind-disturbed sand that shifts constantly and creates the kind of perpetually renewed microhabitat that specialist invertebrates, burrowing insects, and heat-dependent reptiles evolved over thousands of years to exploit. For decades, that open sand had been disappearing. Without the sustained physical disturbance of large grazing animals, a process called vegetation encroachment had been locking the dune surface in place beneath a thickening canopy of coarse grass and woody sea buckthorn. The consequences were measurable and accelerating. As the grass layer closed, the specialist plants that required direct sunlight and exposed substrate vanished. As those plants disappeared, the insect communities that depended on them contracted. As the insects declined, the bird populations and reptile assemblages that fed on them retreated to smaller and smaller fragments of viable habitat. The dunes looked green and productive from a distance. Underneath the canopy, they were becoming ecologically empty. Hoon, whose mandate was drinking water, not wildlife, had spent years attempting to reverse this with the tools available to them: cattle grazing across sections of the reserve, manual clearance teams, cutting back encroaching shrub, localized mechanical intervention. The results were real but limited. The rate of vegetation encroachment consistently outpaced the rate of human removal. The coastline was losing ground. The intervention Hoon and Ark Nature designed in 2007 was not, on paper, complicated. Release 2 female European bison and 1 male into a 330-hectare enclosed section of the Zuid-Kennemerland National Park. Impose a single non-negotiable operational rule: no supplementary winter feeding under any circumstances. Monitor, record, publish the findings. What made it extraordinary, and what earned it the label "the crazy Dutch experiment" from the ecologists watching from outside, was not the logistics. It was the foundational assumption it required. 40 years of published bison research had been conducted almost entirely in forest ecosystems. The species' last wild refugia before the 20th century near-extinction event of 1927, when the global population collapsed to just 54 individuals, were the dense woodlands of Białowieża in Poland. Every peer-reviewed study, every habitat assessment, every conservation framework that followed was built on data from forest-dependent animals. The scientific consensus was not a hypothesis. It was, by 2007, a 40-year empirical record. Ecologist Yvonne Kemp, the lead monitoring coordinator for Pone and Ark Nature, put the prevailing view simply. The general understanding for decades, she later noted, was that European bison were a forest animal. Her team was not entirely sure that was correct. That uncertainty was not shared widely. But in the spring of 2007, the gate opened. And what the bison did in the weeks that followed was not what anyone, including Kemp's team, had specifically predicted. The bison did not behave the way the literature said they would. That is the quiet, foundational fact at the center of everything that follows. In 2007, the scientific consensus was not a matter of debate. Bison were forest animals. They had always been forest animals. The peer-reviewed record said so. The habitat assessment said so. Every researcher who had spent a career tracking the species in the dense woodlands of Bialoiese said so. And when Pone and Ark Nature released 2 females and 1 male into a 330-hectare stretch of open coastal dune between Haarlem and the North Sea, with a strict prohibition on any supplementary winter feeding, the response from the broader ecological community was not cautious optimism. It was, in the words of one ecologist at the time, blunt, the crazy Dutch experiment. A water utility company had decided that 40 years of accumulated peer-reviewed data was incomplete. The scientific establishment was watching to see the animals starve and prove them right. They did not starve. What they did instead was drop to their knees on the sand and roll. Yvonne Kemp, the lead monitoring coordinator for Pone and Ark Nature, was logging the behavior from the ridge with a clipboard. She had a theory about what that rolling, repeated, systematic, distributed across 330 hectares by 3 animals was going to do to the dune surface. She had not yet published it. She was waiting for the data to tell her whether she was right or whether the consensus had been right all along. Before we track the physical mechanism these 3 animals unleashed on the North Sea coast, drop a comment with the state, county, or province you are watching from, and tell us whether your local region is currently fighting its own coastal erosion. Subscribing to this channel keeps you connected to the data as we expose the metrics that conventional management continues to underestimate. Now, back to the coast, because beneath the grass, a catastrophe had been building in silence for decades. The dunes looked green and healthy from a distance. Underneath the canopy of grass and shrub, they were becoming ecologically empty. This is the part of the story that the headline numbers do not capture. The crisis was not visible. There were no bare wastelands, no obvious signs of collapse, nothing that read as an emergency to an observer standing at the reserve boundary. The dunes were green, richly, densely, continuously green, and that was precisely the problem. Vegetation encroachment does not announce itself, it accumulates. Year by year, season by season, coarse grasses and encroaching sea buckthorn extend their root systems across the dune surface, binding the loose sand in place, blocking the wind from reaching the ground, eliminating the very instability that the ecosystem's most specialized inhabitants depend on for survival. The open sand patches, the sun-warmed, constantly shifting, wind-disturbed microenvironments that hundreds of specialist species had spent millennia adapting to, were simply closing over. Quietly, completely, without drama. Pone documented the consequences in operational terms. Manual clearance teams were deployed at scale. Domestic cattle were introduced across sections of the reserve to graze down the encroaching vegetation. The interventions were professionally executed and not inexpensive. They also did not work, not at the speed required. Every cleared patch was temporary. Every grazed corridor recovered. The encroachment velocity was outrunning the human removal rate on a landscape spanning thousands of hectares. The water company responsible for managing a coastal drinking water reserve had run, by every conventional metric, out of tools. Tracking institutional failures of this scale requires an audience that values empirical ground truth over surface-level reporting. If that describes you, hit the subscribe button and join the research collective. Now look closely at what happened next, because in the spring of 2007, Pone stopped deploying human labor and released something the landscape had not encountered in centuries. And then the long-term biological data began arriving, and it told a story that the academic community had spent 40 years insisting was mathematically impossible. The animals rolled, constantly, repeatedly, systematically, each 900-kilogram body grinding into the dune surface and carving out a raw crater of exposed sand. The wallows they left were not incidental, they were geomorphological triggers. When the North Sea winter storms moved across the reserve, they caught the loose edges of those craters and began pulling sand downwind, opening self-sustaining blouts across the landscape, the exact dynamic disturbance that decades of cattle grazing and manual clearance had failed to recreate at anything approaching this scale. The bison had not been asked to do this. They had simply behaved like bison. The winter came, the feeding restriction held, not a single supplementary calorie was introduced. The herd survived, not barely, in peak physical condition. In 2018, the findings were published in the International Journal Restoration Ecology. The dietary analysis was unambiguous. 65% of the herd's annual diet consisted of coastal grasses, not forest understory, not managed hay, coastal grasses. The species that 40 years of peer-reviewed literature had classified as a woodland obligate had been living, thriving, and reproducing on open North Sea dunes the entire time. By 2025, the original 3 animals had become 22. 3 animals, no supplementary feeding, 1 rule, the coastline did the rest. But the Kranzflak data was only the beginning of what this experiment broke open. But the Netherlands is not the only place where letting an animal step outside of an academic textbook forced a government to completely rewrite its laws. If you thought 3 bison rebuilding a coastline was unexpected, wait until you see the Devon flood data. In 2015, 8 beavers were released into an enclosed stretch of the River Otter in Devon, England. The Environment Agency had spent 30 years and millions of pounds attempting to control seasonal flooding in that valley through hard engineering, concrete walls, reinforced barriers, structural interventions designed by professional flood management teams operating at the full capacity of the state's technical resources. The flooding continued, every year, reliably, expensively. The engineers had, by their own operational assessment, run out of structural solutions. The river was categorized, in practical terms, as a managed failure. The establishment's prediction for the beaver release was immediate and specific: localized flooding upstream, agricultural damage, ecosystem disruption. Rodents building mud dams in an already compromised river system was not a serious hydrological intervention. What those 8 animals built from mud and sticks in the months that followed dropped total downstream flood volumes by 30%, not incrementally, 30%. The British government rewrote its national wildlife legislation. 2 countries, 2 completely different ecosystems, 2 species that institutional science had confined to specific, narrow landscape categories. Both broke out. Both repaired what human engineering could not. This regulatory warfare between rigid civil engineering and native biology is unfolding globally. If you've witnessed state agencies clashing over wildlife reintroduction near your own river corridor, drop it in the comments. Your field reports keep our mapping current. Now look at the final invoice for what this institutional paralysis has actually cost. When modern conservation frameworks artificially confine an endangered animal based on where the last remnants managed to survive, they are not reading an ecological preference. They are reading a refugee record. The European bison survived the 20th century in one forest. That forest became the data. The data became the consensus. The consensus became the policy. And the policy, unchallenged for 40 years, locked one of the most geomorphologically powerful animals in Europe away from the coastlines it was capable of repairing. 3 animals released onto sand. No feeding. No intervention. 22 individuals by 2025. A 2018 peer-reviewed validation in Restoration Ecology. A landscape that decades of professional management had failed to restore, recovering within a single decade. Think about what that means. The question is no longer whether bison can survive on open coastal dunes. The question is how many degraded coastlines across Europe are waiting for an animal we have been keeping in the wrong place. What other multi-million-dollar land management industries are we actively funding while blocking the only mechanism capable of fixing what they cannot? Drop your thoughts below alongside your location. If this investigation changed how you see the landscape, subscribe to this channel. Because in our next video, we travel to Devon, where 8 beavers did to 30 years of flood, engineering what 3 bison did to 40 years of ecological theory, and the Environment Agency's own hydrological models never recovered. Yvonne Kemp stood on that ridge with a clipboard and waited for the data to tell her whether she was right. The data answered. The bison were never forest animals. They were animals we found only in forests because that was the only place we had not yet managed to kill them.